Save much of anything. I mean, you were talking about these states, they can only make things work in good times, but California couldn't even make things work in the good times. They haven't really balanced the budget in 6 years, in times when economies were strong and most states were humming along very well. California has a tax system that is very dependent not only on income tax, but on income tax on high-income people. And when those returns were coming in strong and they kept growing spending very fast, much faster than the economy or personal incomes grew, but even faster than could be sustained by the revenues in the good times. So it's no surprise now that the economy's bad that California is just a complete fiscal disaster right now. It's a crisis of their own making.
How come nobody is looking at states like Texas, which Texas is still growing? I mean, it's got its problems, but it's still growing. Business is flocking there. You've got people practically jumping out of windows to get out of New York City because, I mean, seriously, to do business in New York City, it's insane. And the same thing that's happening in California. You've got the unions and everything else. Why aren't we looking at Texas and saying, here's an example of where it works?
Well, that's a good question. I think every state needs to ask itself as they try to dig their way out of this problem. And Texas has a lot of things going for it. It has a constitutional amendment against having a personal income tax. It forces it to rely on sales taxes and other broad-based taxes to pay its bills. But they have a culture that says we're not going to overspend. We're going to keep things.
Well, but they are second in debt. I mean, $33 billion.
But you have to put that relative to the overall economy, which is very, very large in Texas. So it may not be as problematic for them as it might be for other states, which are weak and in deep financial trouble.
Which is the best state, and take this from any of you, which is the state that is in the best shape, and not just because it has no people living there, which one is in the best shape overall? Who wants to take it?
Well, Texas is sitting on a pretty sizable rainy day fund. I think it's now around $10 billion, which gives them a pretty good cushion. And then there are other states that are not so bad, whether it's Colorado or help me out, Josh.
Yeah, well, I think you almost have to grade states a little bit on a curve here. I mean, Texas has done very well, partly because they've had very sensible policies, partly because the industries that are focused in Texas happen to have weathered the recession better than average. But overall, state legislators have done well, responding early to the crisis, cutting spending when they needed to. Some states, like Indiana, for example, has been relatively hard hit because manufacturing's been hit hard. They started very early, saying we need spending restraint in our state. We need to respond to this crisis early by getting the budget under control, growing spending at a level that was sustainable. And they haven't had the kinds of big tax increases that you've seen in some of their neighboring states because they reacted early to the crisis. So Indiana isn't one of the states in the best economic shape right now, but they're doing better than they would have if they hadn't pursued such good policies.
And Troy, California is, I mean, they're hammering the people. I mean, honestly, I don't know how people even accept an IOU from the state. You're like, you gotta be kidding me. Give me my money back. But they're issuing IOUs. They're raising taxes. Is there any chance that California will see the light and reduce some of the restrictions on business? I mean, that's one of the things is the unions out there, the restrictions on businesses. I mean, any chance that's going to happen?
Well, the question becomes at what point it will. It's difficult to see if it hasn't happened now, what could drive that. I mean, you wonder if the state has to go totally over a cliff. I mean, as you pointed out,
well, hasn't it?
Our tax structure is pretty close, and we're still not seeing much of a change on the political side. Now, there's a grassroots reaction to a certain extent. President Obama won California in 2008 with about 64% of the vote. Last year, when we put tax increases on the ballot, they went down with 66% of the vote. And there's also a strong movement for a part-time legislature, sort of modeled on Texas here. So there is a grassroots resistance to it, but the political class is so entrenched and is so committed to this model that they've developed for about 35 years. I mean, we have lost...
Go ahead, finish up.
Well, I was just going to say from 2004 to 2007, we actually lost more people in California to Texas and Oklahoma than we gained from those states during the Dust Bowl. I mean, this is a man-made disaster.
All right, so explain it to me, if you will, Troy, how people are still buying into the progressive idea of big government, big regulation, and lots of spending. How is that even sold to anyone?
Well, part of it, I think there's two aspects to it. One is the elite factor that's driving it, which is that you get a lot of people in communities like parts of Los Angeles and San Francisco who can afford to vote for these kind of policies because they will never affect them. They are not the people who lose their jobs. They are not the people who are driven out of the state. They are sitting on an amount of money that basically immunizes them from this. On a more of a grassroots level, I think what it comes down to in states like California, we're culturally liberal, and there are a lot of people who, if you looked at them across the board, are maybe more libertarian, but because they're culturally liberal, they tend to vote for Democrats and get this entire economic package that was really not what they were betting on. But after time, you would suspect that it would come back and they'd start learning the lesson. We're seeing it a little bit now, but the districts are so safe here that it's very hard. The ship moves very slowly in California.
Well, Glenn, you can also get institutionalized class warfare, and we just saw this in Oregon, where voters supported a dramatic increase in the personal income tax rate as well as the corporate rate in order to pay for various social programs, because to them it was don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. And as long as you have a system that allows that, and California's referendum system allows that in spades,
well,
where
we have that.
year in, year out, they've been able to pass massive spending programs and pay for it through targeted tax increases on the highest income Californians. As a result, they are so top-heavy in their tax system. A couple of years ago, when they passed a millionaire's tax in order to pay for mental health services, my God, you know, you have to be, if you're a millionaire still living in California, you need mental health services.
Right, you do. All right, I want to come back to the targeted taxes and spreading the wealth, and because what you just described in California is what's happening here.
Sure.
I'd like to actually compare California to the federal government and see, is there any difference? As goes California, so goes the nation. Next. California's a mess. We're going to be out in California all next week, looking at some of the problems, some of the solutions, meeting some of the people there. It's a mess, and when that thing comes crashing down, correct me if I'm wrong. Well, let me introduce our guest. Troy Senek, he is in California. He's a contributing editor for the Center for Individual Freedom. Scott Hodge, president of the Tax Foundation. It is a nonpartisan tax research organization based in Washington, D.C. And Josh Barrow, he is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which focuses on tax and budget issues. Here's what concerns me, and I want to look at California and compared to the federal government. Before we go there, California, everybody agree that it's going to be the first state to collapse?
It's already collapsed.
Yeah, right. But it's just going to keep coming unhinged until we might as well take a star off the flag because the federal government will be running it, right? When we throw a rope around California and then the rest of these states start to decay and we have to throw a rope around them, how many of these can collapse before we got nothing left? You understand what I'm saying? They're going to. We're not saying states shore yourself up. What we're saying is we'll come in and rescue all of you. We can't do that. How long before the whole thing sinks down into the ground?
Well, I think it's like the economist Herb Stein said, it's, if something is unsustainable, it will stop. And California can't continue like it has been forever. I think legislators...
It won't stop because the federal government... So what they're doing is, what our federal government is doing is just... Everything's being kicked up to the federal government. They say, we'll rescue you. Well, that's unsustainable. We all know that's unsustainable, too. So...
But we've seen the outrage over the bailouts of AIG, General Motors, and Chrysler, and on down the road, all the banks. Can you imagine if we actually go out and bail out a state? I think Americans, the Tea Party movement would go nuts over this.
But, I mean, aren't we already doing that? Troy, are we not already bailing California out?
Well, it's getting a certain amount of federal assistance. It hasn't gotten as much as it would like, and hopefully it won't. But I think that it would inspire a popular backlash, not only because we've been on display for the entire nation as an example of failed government, but also California has that cultural thing about it that we have always given off this vibe that we're just going to do whatever we want, and in this case we've done it to complete excess. And I think the rest of the nation rightly thinks you guys need to sober up.
Oh, I think the rest of the nation looks at California as the rest of the world looks at the United States and says, you got problems? Drill for oil. I mean, you've got resources there.
Absolutely.
Drill for oil. Stop telling the rest of the world how we're supposed to live. You know, you're complaining. California complains about, you know, the price of gasoline, et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course you're complaining about gasoline. The way you're having to refine it and everything else.